Somewhere between midnight and dawn, something vanished from the most heavily protected corridors of Buckingham Palace. And for several terrifying hours, almost nobody realized it was gone. There was no shattered glass, no blaring alarm, no panic security call echoing through marble hallways. There was only silence, the kind of silence that usually surrounds institutions convinced they are untouchable. But by sunrise, that silence had become something far more dangerous. 3 official engagements had disappeared from the calendar of Princess, and without explanation, senior aides were being summoned behind sealed doors. Access permissions inside restricted palace corridors were changing by the minute, and according to whispers now circulating through royal media circles, what began as a routine overnight archive audit had suddenly triggered one of the most aggressive internal investigations the modern monarchy had faced in decades. Because this was never about paperwork. This was about documents so sensitive that even senior members of the royal household rarely discuss them aloud, documents allegedly tied to succession planning, private state authority, and confidential directives quietly shaped during the final years of Queen Elizabeth II. And when those files vanished, Princess did not ask what was missing. She asked who already knew they were there. So what exactly disappeared from the vaults of Buckingham Palace? And why did it force one of the crown's most trusted guardians to lock down the palace before even informing King Charles III? That answer may be more disturbing than anyone inside the monarchy was prepared for. At 2:17 in the morning, according to administrative whispers emerging from inside Buckingham Palace, a senior archival officer performing a late-night records audit allegedly noticed something so small it almost went ignored. One shelf inside a restricted corridor, an area protected by layered permissions, biometric access, and decades of institutional protocol, appeared perfectly normal. Nothing broken, nothing disturbed, nothing visibly out of place. And yet, something was missing. At first, the officer reportedly assumed it was a cataloging error, the kind of bureaucratic discrepancy quietly corrected before sunrise, a misplaced folder, an outdated inventory code, perhaps a document temporarily transferred for legal review. But when secondary records were pulled, the atmosphere changed instantly. The missing materials were not ceremonial papers. They were not historical correspondence. And they were certainly not documents meant for public archives. According to palace insiders familiar with administrative structures, the Vanish files allegedly contain confidential succession frameworks, estate authority memoranda linked to Balmoral Castle and Sandringham House, and private institutional directives dating back to the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. That was the moment routine procedure became institutional panic. Staff members who had been preparing to leave for the evening were suddenly ordered to remain inside secured administrative wings. Internal communication channels reportedly shifted to emergency restrictions. Mobile devices were quietly collected from selected personnel. Doors that had remained open for decades began locking automatically. And somewhere inside that growing silence, one phone call changed everything. Because according to multiple palace whispers, the first senior royal contacted that night was not King Charles. It was Princess Anne. Why? That question alone reportedly sent shockwaves through the palace. Those who understand royal operations have long described Anne as a monarchy's institutional enforcer, the one figure trusted to act when emotional diplomacy is no longer enough. Calm, precise, uncompromising. And when she arrived inside Buckingham Palace before sunrise, insiders claimed she wasn't asking whether a mistake had been made. She was already preparing for sabotage. Within minutes, access badges across multiple administrative wings allegedly began failing without warning. Senior staff arriving for early briefings found themselves locked out of offices they had entered freely for years. Archive permissions disappeared. Security routes changed. Entire corridors fell under silent restriction. But then, investigators discovered something even more disturbing. Security footage covering one narrow archival corridor, the exact corridor investigators needed most, had not been erased. It had been corrupted, not destroyed, not disabled. Corrupted just enough to leave gaps where answers should have existed. And for the first time that morning, according to insiders, the investigation stopped feeling like an accident, because whoever removed those documents appeared to understand palace systems with terrifying precision. No alarms, No forced entry. No visible disruption. Only carefully timed movement. Hidden inside the routines of one of the oldest institutions on Earth. By 6:14 a.m., sources claim Princesson had personally ordered a full internal containment review. No outside agencies. No public statements. No leaks. Not yet. Instead, a small circle of legal advisors, security specialists, and longtime institutional aides were quietly summoned behind closed doors. And reportedly asked them next left even veteran courtiers unsettled. She didn't ask who had access. She asked who had motive. And at that exact moment, the crisis inside Buckingham Palace stopped being a missing documents investigation and started becoming a hunt for betrayal from within. If you thought that was alarming, what investigators uncovered in the palace access logs just hours later would send an even darker message to the heart of the monarchy. By mid-morning, the silence inside Buckingham Palace no longer felt procedural. It felt surgical. Corridors that only hours earlier had operated with the quiet rhythm of routine monarchy administration were now moving under an entirely different kind of discipline. Doors remained closed longer than usual. Conversations stopped the moment unfamiliar footsteps approached. Even longtime staff members, people who had spent decades navigating the crown's most protected spaces, reportedly began watching one another with a caution none of them could remember feeling before. Because Princesson was no longer searching for missing documents. She was searching for patterns. According to administrative whispers emerging from inside the palace, the Princess Royal had personally ordered investigators to stop focusing on the archive shelves themselves and instead reconstruct every movement that had taken place across restricted administrative zones during the previous 72 hours. Not just who entered, not just who exited, who paused, who doubled back, who appeared somewhere they normally had no reason to be. And what investigators allegedly uncovered in those first access reports sent an unmistakable chill through the inner household. At first, the data looked harmless. Badge entries, security timestamps, routine authorization logs. The kind of digital paperwork no one ever notices until something goes wrong. But as analysts began layering movement records against standard staff schedules, a pattern slowly began to emerge, and it did not look accidental. Several archive permissions had reportedly activated during hours when their assigned personnel were not even scheduled to be inside the building. One corridor showed access activity at 1:43 a.m., another at 2:06, a third at 2:11, each event separated by minutes, each movement brief, each entry legal. And that was exactly what made it terrifying. There had been no forced override, no emergency breach, no visible signs of intrusion. Whoever moved through those corridors had done, so using permissions the palace itself recognized. By this stage, insiders claim even Princesson's closest advisors had begun accepting a possibility no one wanted to say aloud. This may never have been an external operation. It may have started from inside. That realization reportedly changed the atmosphere of every meeting that followed. Sources familiar with internal discussions claim, and immediately ordered a second layer of analysis, one not focused on access alone, but on behavioral consistency, which employees had recently requested unusual schedule changes, which departments had experienced unexplained staffing substitutions, which senior aides had suddenly delegated archive responsibilities they normally handled personally. And as those questions spread through the palace, something else began changing. People stopped speaking freely. Long-serving administrative staff allegedly began leaving meetings without making eye contact. Junior aides started checking doors before discussing even routine schedules. Phones were reportedly left outside conference rooms. Handwritten notes replaced digital communication. Even harmless conversations about travel calendars and ceremonial preparations suddenly felt loaded with hidden meaning. Because by now, everyone inside Buckingham Palace understood one thing. The person being investigated might be someone they had worked beside for years. Then came another discovery, and this one reportedly forced the investigation into even darker territory. During a secondary review of restricted badge activity, investigators allegedly identified a clearance authorization connected to a corridor no longer used for active archival transfers, a passage deep within an older administrative wing, rarely accessed except during private estate reviews involving Balmoral Castle. Sandringham House, and legacy directives dating back to Queen Elizabeth II. The timestamp? 2:24 a.m., just 13 minutes after the final known archive movement. And according to insiders, that authorization should never have been active, not for anyone, when that detail reached Princess, and sources claim the tone inside the command room changed instantly. No raised voices, no dramatic reaction, just silence. The kind of silence that made even senior courtiers stop taking notes. Because if a dormant authorization had somehow been reactivated without triggering security escalation, the implications were devastating. This wasn't just theft. This suggested system familiarity, possibly system manipulation, possibly preparation. By early afternoon, reports suggest Princess and quietly expanded the internal review beyond archives entirely. Communication histories, personnel transfers, temporary contractors, legal consultations, even ceremonial scheduling records were allegedly pulled for cross-reference. And then, according to multiple palace whispers, something deeply unsettling surfaced. One name, not publicly, not officially, but privately, a name connected to sensitive administrative work. Someone trusted, someone established, someone whose presence inside restricted corridors would never have raised suspicion. Insiders say no accusation was made, no suspension announced, no confrontation initiated, at least not yet. Instead, Princess reportedly did something that unsettled even her inner circle. She ordered that individuals' access remain active, for now, because, and didn't just want to know who entered the archive, she wanted to know what they would do next. And as evening began falling over Buckingham Palace, the palace was no longer operating under normal royal procedure. It was operating under surveillance. And before the night was over, one quiet piece of corrupted footage would reveal something no one inside the monarchy was prepared to see. By the time darkness settled over Buckingham Palace for the second night in a row, the palace no longer felt like the polished symbol of continuity the public had known for generations. Behind its illuminated windows, inside corridors lined with portraits, treaties, and centuries of institutional memory, something colder had taken hold. Observation. Every movement was being noticed. Every routine was being measured. And according to administrative whispers emerging from inside the royal household, Princess had now entered the most dangerous phase of the investigation. Not recovery, but confirmation. Because by this stage, the Princess Royal reportedly believed the missing documents were never the true objective. They were the distraction. The real operation may have been something far more deliberate. Sources familiar with internal security, reviews claim its hand-picked investigative team spent the evening reconstructing fragments of corrupted surveillance data pulled from the restricted archive corridor. At first, the footage appeared unusable. Distorted timestamps, fragmented frame drops, digital interference, and image gaps positioned at exactly the moments investigators needed most. To many inside the room, it looked like dead evidence. To Princess, it looked engineered. And that changed everything. According to insiders, rather than dismissing the corrupted files, and allegedly ordered a frame-by-frame recovery using archive backup servers buried deep within older palace security infrastructure. Systems rarely touched except during state-level protocol reviews. For nearly 3 hours, investigators reportedly watched silence, empty corridors, static, shadow, nothing. Then at 11:42 p.m., something moved. Not clearly, not long enough for immediate identification. Just a figure, one silhouette, crossing the far end of a restricted corridor. No one outside a tightly controlled administrative circle should have been able to access. The image lasted less than 3 seconds. But according to those present, those 3 seconds changed the investigation permanently. Because the figure did not hesitate, did not search, did not look around, did not behave like someone entering unfamiliar territory. Whoever appeared in that footage moved with absolute confidence, as though they had walked that corridor dozens of times before. And then investigators noticed something even more unsettling. The individual never once looked toward the surveillance camera, as if they already knew exactly where it was. By midnight, reports suggest the atmosphere inside the command room had become almost unbearable. Legal advisors stopped speaking. Security analysts reportedly began exchanging looks without saying a word. Even veteran palace officials, people who had survived scandals, abdications, media wars, and institutional crises, allegedly struggled to hide what they were beginning to understand. This wasn't opportunistic theft. This looked rehearsed. Princess and reportedly watched the recovered footage twice, then a third time, and after several moments of complete silence, insiders claimed she asked only one question. Not, can we identify them? But, how long have you been doing this? That single question reportedly froze the room, because it was no longer investigating one missing folder. She was beginning to suspect a pattern, and the deeper investigators looked, the worse it became. By 12:26 a.m., according to administrative whispers, analysts were instructed to pull not 1 week of archive movement, not 1 month, but 5 years, badge activity, temporary permissions, maintenance clearances, legal access requests, ceremonial archive transfers, everything. And what began surfacing from those deeper records reportedly shook even senior investigators. Small inconsistencies, at first, almost invisible. A corridor open for 38 seconds longer than necessary. A restricted badge activated on a day its owner was officially overseas. An archive drawer logged as sealed, yet digitally marked as accessed. Individually, meaningless. Together, potentially devastating. Because according to sources close to the investigation, the pattern did not suggest a one-night operation. It suggested patience, discipline, testing, learning, possibly over years. And if that was true, then whoever had taken the documents may have been preparing long before anyone inside the monarchy even realized the system was vulnerable. By this stage, Princess and reportedly expanded the investigation beyond administrative staff entirely. Private legal consultants, estate advisors, rotational security officers, even individuals connected to historical reviews involving Balmoral Castle and legacy holdings associated with Queen Elizabeth II allegedly came under quiet review, and that decision reportedly sent shockwaves through the upper household, because for the first time, even people who considered themselves institutionally untouchable began realizing something terrifying. No one was outside Princess Anne's reach. Then, just after 1 a.m., another discovery emerged. Investigators reviewing communication records allegedly found a series of encrypted outbound data requests originating from an internal terminal connected to archive administration. The timestamps? Within minutes of the missing files. The destination? Unknown. No external recipient. No registered transfer. No approved duplication request. Just outbound activity, then silence. And according to insiders, that possibility terrified senior aides far more than the physical disappearance itself, because missing documents could potentially be recovered. But copied documents could already be anywhere by now. Reports suggest even King Charles III had begun receiving increasingly urgent summaries of the crisis. But Princess and reportedly refused to release full findings. Not yet. Not until she knew exactly who was standing behind the operation. And as investigators prepared to cross-reference the silhouette from the recovered footage against private personnel records. One senior advisor allegedly entered the room carrying a file no one expected to see. A file marked, Her Late Majesty, Restricted Continuity Review. And in that moment, the investigation stopped being about stolen documents and started becoming about something Queen Elizabeth II may have quietly suspected before anyone else. When the file marked Her Late Majesty, Restricted Continuity Review, was quietly placed on a polished oak table, every conversation inside the secured operations room reportedly stopped. No phones vibrated. No chairs moved. Even the quiet scratching of pens against paper seemed to disappear. According to administrative whispers emerging from inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere in that room changed so completely that several longtime palace advisors would later describe it as the moment the investigation stopped feeling like a security crisis and started feeling personal, because the seal on that file did not belong to a modern administrative department. It reportedly carried authorization dating back to final private institutional reviews personally overseen by Queen Elizabeth II herself. And according to insiders familiar with Royal Archival Protocol, documents carrying that designation were almost never reopened unless the monarchy believed it was facing a direct threat to long-term institutional continuity. Princess and reportedly stared at the file for several seconds without speaking. Then, without looking at anyone in the room, she allegedly gave a single instruction: open it. What investigators discovered next reportedly changed the direction of the entire operation. Inside were not speeches, not ceremonial records, not public constitutional notes. Instead, sources claim the file contained private vulnerability assessments, handwritten succession annotations, internal estate authority concerns, and confidential memoranda connected to legacy holdings involving Balmoral Castle, Sandringham House, and several protected institutional structures tied directly to the Crown's long-term stability. But one page reportedly froze the room, because in the margin of a handwritten note, allegedly written during the final years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, there was a sentence few people inside the palace had ever seen. According to insiders who later heard fragments repeated privately, the note allegedly warned, asterisk, the greatest threat to continuity may not come from public opposition but from trusted proximity. Asterisk, and suddenly, every suspicion Princess and had been quietly building over the previous 48 hours no longer looked paranoid. It looked anticipated. By 2:11 a.m., sources claim and ordered the investigation widened immediately. Not tomorrow, not after consultation. Immediately, personnel histories were reportedly reopened. Legacy archive permissions dating back years were pulled. Temporary security assignments connected to state visits, estate reviews, and restricted archival transfers were quietly reconstructed. And what investigators allegedly uncovered next sent a shock wave through the upper levels of the royal household. One name kept appearing. Not once, not twice, again and again and again. Different years, different departments, different access categories, but always connected somehow to restricted movements no one had ever questioned at the time. According to administrative whisperers, this individual had never triggered a formal complaint, never failed a background review, never attracted disciplinary concern. In fact, that may have been exactly why nobody noticed. They were trusted, deeply trusted. Someone whose presence inside restricted corridors would have looked completely normal. Someone senior enough to move quietly, but invisible enough to avoid attention. When that pattern was reportedly presented to Princess, and insiders claim she didn't react emotionally, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for confirmation. She asked for surveillance. Live. That decision reportedly stunned even her closest advisors, because up until that moment, the investigation had been historical, reviewing what had already happened. Now, Princess, and wanted to know whether the operation was still active. By dawn, according to palace whispers, silent observation protocols had allegedly been activated across selected administrative corridors inside Buckingham Palace. Badge alerts were rerouted privately. Movement notifications were reportedly sent directly to an inner security team. Routine staffing schedules were left unchanged intentionally, creating the appearance that nothing had changed. But behind that calm surface, the palace had become a trap. And according to insiders, it didn't take long. At 6:38 a.m., investigators allegedly received the first silent alert: restricted movement, archive wing, secondary corridor, authorized badge, no scheduled access, no documented purpose. And the name attached to that authorization was the same name investigators had been quietly tracking through years of irregular records. For several seconds, sources claimed nobody in the room spoke, because if the same individual had returned, while the palace was under full internal lockdown, then Princess Anne's worst suspicion was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time. Reports suggest and stood immediately. No hesitation, no discussion, no delegation. For the first time since the crisis began, the Princess Royal allegedly decided to move personally. Accompanied by only 2 trusted security advisors and 1 senior legal official, and reportedly left the operations room and headed toward the restricted archive corridors herself. And as they moved through the quiet marble hallways of Buckingham Palace, one terrifying question reportedly followed every step. What if the person behind the missing documents was not stealing information for money, not for leverage, not even for scandal, but for influence over the future of the crown itself? And when Princess Anne finally reached the secured corridor, she reportedly saw something no one inside the monarchy was prepared to explain. Because standing outside the archive vault, waiting, was someone who should never have been there at all. Standing beneath the muted security lights of the restricted archive corridor inside Buckingham Palace, Princess Anne reportedly stopped walking. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Not the two security advisors at her side, not the senior legal official standing just behind her, not even the figure waiting silently near the sealed archive vault. According to administrative whispers later circulating through royal media circles, the corridor had become so quiet that investigators could allegedly hear the low electrical hum of the biometric locks echoing against the marble walls. Because standing there, holding an active security badge that should never have been triggered that morning, was not an intruder, not a contractor, not a junior employee, not an outside threat. Reports suggest it was someone whose face was deeply familiar inside the institution, someone who had spent years moving quietly through the monarchy's most sensitive administrative networks, someone trusted enough that their presence in restricted corridors had never once triggered suspicion. And for the first time since the crisis began, Princess Anne was no longer chasing patterns. She was looking directly at one. Sources close to palace operations claim, and did not immediately speak. She allegedly studied the individual in complete silence, as though measuring not just what they had done, but how long they had been preparing for this moment. Then, according to multiple internal whispers, she asked a single question. Not, "Why are you here?" Not, "What did you take?" But, "How much has already left this palace?" Those words reportedly changed everything, because by now, the investigation was no longer focused on missing documents. It was focused on copied information, copied directives, copied estate memoranda, copied continuity plans, and possibly copied vulnerabilities tied to the crown itself. According to insiders familiar with what followed, the individual reportedly did not deny being there. They did not run. They did not panic. And that calm response allegedly unsettled even veteran security personnel. Because if the person standing in front of Princess Anne felt no fear, it suggested something far more disturbing. Preparation, confidence, possibly even belief. Within minutes, sources claimed the corridor was quietly sealed. Additional security teams were allegedly rerouted through private access routes, while senior legal advisors initiated what internal memoranda reportedly described as containment protocol. No public alarm, no visible confrontation, no dramatic removals, because the monarchy, above everything else, protects continuity. But behind closed doors, the questions were becoming impossible to ignore. How long had sensitive materials been accessed? How many records had been duplicated? Who else knew? And perhaps most terrifying of all, was this person acting alone? According to administrative whispers, the individual's device history was immediately secured for forensic review. Archive terminals used during previous estate audits involving Balmoral Castle and Sandringham House were allegedly frozen. Historical communication logs dating back years were quietly reopened. And what investigators reportedly discovered over the next several hours sent shockwaves through the upper household. Because the irregularities didn't begin this week. They didn't begin this month. According to sources close to the internal review, some of the earliest anomalies may have stretched back to the final institutional years of Queen Elizabeth II herself, which suddenly gave terrifying new meaning to the handwritten warning found inside her restricted continuity file. Asterisk, the greatest threat to continuity may not come from public opposition, but from trusted proximity. Asterisk, by the time King Charles III was reportedly given the full findings, insiders claim the emotional weight inside the private briefing room had become almost unbearable. Charles was already navigating one of the most fragile periods of his reign, balancing public duty, institutional transition, and ongoing health concerns. Yet now, according to palace whispers, he was being confronted with something even more destabilizing. Not scandal, not media pressure, not political criticism, but erosion from within. Reports suggest the king listened in complete silence as Princess Anne personally outlined the access patterns, the corrupted surveillance, the copied data trails, and the possibility that the monarchy's most protected systems have been quietly studied for years by someone operating beneath the shield of trust. And when the briefing ended, insiders claimed nobody spoke for several seconds, because by now, everyone in that room understood the truth. The missing documents were never the real story. They were the warning. In the days that followed, according to palace administrative whispers, access structures inside Buckingham Palace reportedly changed permanently. Archive permissions were rewritten. Legacy clearances were revoked. Private estate reviews were moved under tighter institutional oversight. Entire sections of administrative movement allegedly fell under continuous silent monitoring. No public statement, no dramatic announcement, no official confirmation, just quiet change. And perhaps that became the most haunting part of all, because from the outside, the monarchy still looked exactly the same. The ceremonies continued, the gates opened, the cameras rolled, the smiles remained, but behind those ancient walls, something had changed forever, because Princess and may have contained the immediate crisis. But according to those closest to the investigation, one question still remains. If one trusted figure could move this deeply inside the institution for this long, how many shadows are still left behind? If you found this investigation as chilling as the palace insiders did, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the next royal revelation may already be unfolding behind closed doors. And until next time, keep watching The Crown.